The 6,000 years ago, somewhere along the Nile, and a bowl of wheat paste has been left out too long. Nobody notices at first. It's just flour and water, forgotten on a warm shelf, the kind of mistake that happens in every kitchen in every era. But something invisible is happening inside that bowl. Wild yeast, drifting through the air the way it drifts through every kitchen on Earth right now, including yours, has landed on the paste and started to feed. Bubbles rise. The mixture swells. Smells sour, alive, slightly wrong. Someone will never know who decides to bake it anyway. What comes out of the fire that day is not what they expected. It's lighter. It's got structure, air pockets, a strange springy chew. It doesn't taste like the flat, dense paste bread everyone has been eating for 1,000 years. Tastes like something has happened to it. Something has, in the most literal sense, come alive inside the dough and changed it forever. That accident is the reason bread exists as you know it today. Not a plan. Not a recipe. A mistake, left on a shelf, colonized by microorganisms nobody could see, that somehow turned into one of the most powerful technologies human civilization has ever produced. You've probably never thought about bread as a technology. You think about it as breakfast, as the thing under your sandwich, the basket at a restaurant, the bag going stale on your counter. But bread is closer to a controlled biological experiment happening in your kitchen than it is to food in the way you think about a carrot or an egg. And once you understand what's actually happening inside a loaf, chemically, historically, politically, you will never look at a slice the same way again. Here's what almost nobody tells you. The hundreds of bread types on Earth, from a French baguette to an Ethiopian injera to a New York bagel, are not hundreds of different recipes. They're the same 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and some kind of leavening, pushed into wildly different shapes by history, geography, empire, and desperation. Understanding bread means understanding almost every major turning point in human civilization, because for most of recorded history, bread wasn't a side dish. It was survival, currency, and control all baked into the same loaf. And by the end of this, you're going to find out that the bread sitting in your pantry right now, soft, pre-sliced, shelf-stable for 2 weeks, is not bread in any sense your ancestors would recognize. It's something else entirely. Something engineered. And what it's engineered to do might surprise you. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is stranger than you think. Before that accidental Egyptian loaf, humans had already been eating a version of bread for thousands of years, just not the kind you'd recognize. Archaeologists working a site in northeastern Jordan found charred crumbs of flatbread dating back roughly 14,400 years. That's before agriculture, before farming existed as a concept. Hunter-gatherers were grinding wild wheat and barley grains by hand, mixing the flour with water, and cooking it on hot stones, thousands of years before anyone planted a single seed on purpose. Stop and sit with that for a second. Bread predates farming. We didn't invent agriculture and then figure out bread as a byproduct. Some researchers now argue it might have happened the other way around, that the desire for more grain to make more bread may have been one of the very reasons humans started domesticating wild grasses in the first place. The oldest ambition in human history might not have been shelter or fire or weapons. It might have been the craving for a better loaf. That flatbread from Jordan had no leavening. It was dense, hard, more like a cracker than what you'd call bread today. And versions of that same dense, unleavened bread survive right now, in your world, on tables all over the planet. Tortillas in Mexico, chapati in India, matzo at a Passover Seder, lavash in Armenia. Every single one of these is a direct descendant of that 14,400-year-old flatbread, made the exact same fundamental way. Grain ground down, mixed with water, cooked fast and hot, with nothing given time to rise. But then came that accident in Egypt, and everything split in two. From that point on, bread had 2 competing philosophies fighting inside it, and they're still fighting today whether you realize it or not. There's flatbread, fast, dense, ancient, unleavened, and there's risen bread, the kind full of air and time and living microorganisms, the kind that takes patience most humans didn't have the luxury to spare. The Egyptians didn't just discover risen bread by accident once. They industrialized it. By around 3000 BCE, ancient Egypt had bakeries producing bread at a scale that's honestly hard to picture. Some estimates suggest workers building the pyramids were partially paid in bread and beer, both made from the same fermented grain base. Bread wasn't a meal. It was payroll. Entire economies ran on loaves. But here's what researchers actually found when they started reconstructing ancient Egyptian bread-making techniques. The loaves weren't made with anything close to what we'd call yeast today. They were relying on wild airborne fermentation, the same natural process, totally uncontrolled, that any open bowl of flour and water will eventually catch if you leave it out long enough. Egyptian bakers essentially had to keep starters alive, pots of already fermented dough saved from the last batch, used to inoculate the next one. Sound familiar? It should. That's sourdough. The trendy, expensive, Instagram-famous sourdough loaf you might have paid $9 for at a bakery last week is, biologically speaking, almost identical in method to bread being made in Egyptian kitchens 5,000 years ago. You're not eating a modern artisanal invention. You're eating the oldest surviving bread technology on the planet, dressed up in a canvas tote bag. And that's your first reframe. What you probably assumed, that sourdough is some kind of modern hipster reinvention of bread, is backwards. Sourdough isn't the deviation. It's the original. Everything else, everything softer and sweeter and faster, is the deviation. And the reason that matters is because it means the story of bread for the last century hasn't been a story of improvement. It's been a story of speeding something up that was never supposed to be fast, and you're about to find out what got lost in that shortcut. Let's talk about how sourdough actually works, because the mechanism is stranger than most people realize. A sourdough starter is a living culture of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria, captured from the air and from the flour itself, kept alive indefinitely by regular feedings of new flour and water. Some bakeries claim their starters are over 100 years old. Continuously fed, continuously alive, an unbroken biological lineage passed down like a family heirloom, except the heirloom is a jar of bubbling paste that will die if you forget about it for too long. Inside that jar, wild yeast eats the sugars in the flour and produces carbon dioxide, which is what makes the dough rise, the same basic principle as any bread. But sourdough also hosts colonies of lactic acid bacteria living alongside the yeast, and those bacteria are what create the tang, the sourness, the flavor that gives the bread its name. The fermentation process is slow, often 12 to 24 hours or longer, and that slowness isn't a flaw. It's the entire point. During that long fermentation, something happens that most people never think about. The bacteria and enzymes in the dough start partially breaking down the gluten proteins and the complex starches in the flour before you even eat it. Some nutrition researchers have found evidence that this extended fermentation may make certain nutrients more bioavailable and may reduce some of the compounds in wheat that make it harder for sensitive digestive systems to process. This is still an active area of research and not a settled medical claim, but here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The fast, mass-produced bread most people eat today skips that entire process almost completely. And that skipped step might be a bigger deal than anyone in a grocery store aisle realizes. We'll come back to that. Keep it in your pocket. It's going to matter a lot later. For now, let's follow bread out of Egypt and watch what happens to it as it spreads across the ancient world. Because every culture that touched bread bent it into something different, shaped by climate, geography, and what people actually had access to. In the arid regions of the Middle East and North Africa, where fuel for ovens was scarce and cooking needed to happen fast over open fire or hot stone, flatbreads dominated. Pita, with its signature pocket formed by steam violently expanding inside the dough during a blast of extreme heat. Lavash, thin enough to see light through. Naan, cooked by slapping the dough directly onto the scorching interior wall of a clay tandoor oven, where it cooks in under 2 minutes. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Romans took Egyptian fermentation techniques and turned bread into a full-blown industrial and political weapon. By the height of the Roman Empire, the state was distributing free or subsidized grain and bread to hundreds of thousands of citizens in Rome. A program historians call the bread dole. This wasn't charity. It was crowd control. A hungry population is a dangerous population, and Roman emperors understood something that governments still understand today. Control the bread supply and you control the peace. That phrase should sit uncomfortably with you for a second, because it's not ancient history. It's a pattern that repeats itself over and over all the way into the modern era, and you're going to see it show up again with much higher stakes. Later in this story, Rome also gave us something else. Public bakeries at a scale the world hadn't seen before, with professional bakers organized into guilds, using large stone ovens that could produce hundreds of loaves a day. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Pompeii found bakeries frozen in time by volcanic ash in 79C millstones for grinding grain, brick ovens, and in one case, dozens of carbonized loaves still sitting where they were left the moment Mount Vesuvius erupted. One of those loaves even has a maker's stamp pressed into the crust, a literal brand name from 2,000 years ago, fossilized in ash. Bread, it turns out, has always been branded. It's just that the packaging used to be volcanic rock instead of plastic. Now travel north into medieval Europe, and the story of bread gets darker, and a lot more revealing about how societies actually treat their poorest citizens. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food. It was a rigid social hierarchy you could literally taste. Wealthy nobles ate bread made from finely sifted white wheat flour, soft, pale, expensive, because the sifting process to remove the bran and germ was labor-intensive and wasteful of grain. The poor ate bread made from whatever was left: rye, barley, oats, even beans or acorns in famine years, mixed with coarse, unsifted flour that produced dense, dark, often gritty loaves. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. White bread, the soft pale stuff associated for centuries with wealth and status, is nutritionally inferior to the dark, coarse bread the poor were forced to eat. Whole grain bread retains the bran and germ of the wheat kernel, which is where most of the fiber, B vitamins, and minerals actually live. For most of European history, rich people were paying a premium to eat bread that was, in a very real biological sense, worse for them, and poor people were unknowingly eating the more nutritious option because they had no other choice. Status was inverted from nutrition almost perfectly. And if that sounds like it couldn't possibly still be true in the modern world, hold that thought, because we are going to circle directly back to it. Bread wasn't just a class marker in medieval Europe, it was regulated by law, sometimes brutally. England's Assize of Bread and Ale, a law dating back to the 13th century, set strict standards for the weight, price, and quality of loaves sold by bakers. Bakers caught cheating customers, shorting the weight of a loaf to save on flour, could face serious punishment, from fines to public humiliation to, in some accounts, being dragged through the streets tied to a sledge with the offending loaf hung around their neck. Some historians trace the origin of the phrase baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12, directly back to this law. Bakers, terrified of being caught underweight and punished, started throwing in an extra loaf or roll as insurance against the scales. A tradition you might still associate with generosity actually started as a legal survival tactic born out of fear of government punishment. Bread has always been more political than it looks, and nowhere does that become more violently, unmistakably clear than in 18th century France, in the years leading up to one of the most consequential events in modern political history. By the late 1780s, France was in the grip of a devastating series of poor grain harvests. Bread prices, already the single largest expense in a typical working family's budget, often consuming half or more of daily wages, spiked catastrophically. Historians estimate that in the months before 1789, the price of bread in Paris had climbed so high that an ordinary laborer might have to spend nearly all of their income just to feed their family a basic loaf. You've probably heard the phrase associated, rightly or wrongly, with Queen Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake." Most historians now agree she likely never said it. But the myth persisted precisely because it captured something true and enraging about the era. An aristocracy perceived as catastrophically disconnected from the basic reality that people were starving over the price of bread. Bread shortages and soaring prices weren't a footnote to the French Revolution. They were one of its primary engines. Bread riots broke out across French cities in the months before the storming of the Bastille. In October of 1789, a crowd of thousands of Parisian women, furious over bread prices and shortages, marched roughly 12 miles to the Palace of Versailles, demanding the royal family address the crisis, and effectively forced King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette back to Paris under armed escort. That march is considered one of the pivotal turning points of the entire revolution. A shortage of loaves helped topple a monarchy that had ruled for centuries. Think about that the next time you toss a half-eaten baguette in the trash without a second thought. For most of human history, and in some parts of the world still today, that loaf you're throwing away represents something closer to political stability than a snack. Speaking of the baguette, let's talk about how it actually got its iconic shape. because the popular explanation you've probably heard online is mostly myth. There's a widely circulated story that Napoleon ordered bread to be shaped into long thin loaves so soldiers could carry them in trouser leg straps on the march. It's a great story. It's also almost certainly false, or at least unproven by any serious historical source. What historians actually believe is closer to something less romantic but more interesting. Long, thin loaves of bread existed in various forms in France for a long time, but the baguette as we know it, with its signature crackling crust and open, airy crumb, really solidified as a distinct product in the late 19th and especially early 20th century, closely tied to the invention and spread of steam-injected ovens. Steam is the secret nobody mentions when they talk about baguettes. When a baguette goes into a hot oven with a blast of injected steam, that steam keeps the exterior of the dough moist and pliable just long enough for the loaf to fully expand, what bakers call oven spring, before the crust hardens. Without that steam, the crust would seal too early, trapping the dough and producing a dense, stunted loaf instead of that dramatic, blistered golden shell. The French took this seriously enough to write it into law. In 1993, France passed the Décret Pain, a legal decree defining exactly what can be called a baguette de tradition française. It must be made on site, from only 4 ingredients: wheat flour, water, salt, and yeast, with no additives, no preservatives, and no freezing during production. Any bakery that violates those rules technically cannot legally call its product a traditional baguette. Sit with that for a second. In France, what you're allowed to name your bread is a matter of federal law. There is no equivalent regulation almost anywhere else in the world, which is exactly why, when you cross into most other countries, bread stops meaning what you think it means and starts meaning something engineered for an entirely different purpose. And this is where the story takes a hard turn, because everything up to this point, Egypt, Rome, medieval Europe, revolutionary France, is the story of bread as a slow, living, fermented thing shaped by scarcity and time. What happens next is the story of bread getting hijacked by industry. And it happened faster than almost anyone realizes. What you're about to hear was largely buried under decades of advertising, branding, and a very deliberate rewriting of what fresh bread was supposed to mean. In 1961, British scientists at a place called the Chorleywood Flour Milling and Bakery Research Association developed something that would quietly rewire the entire global bread industry within a generation. It's called the Chorleywood Bread Process, and if you've eaten a soft, pre-sliced loaf of sandwich bread any time in the last several decades, there's a very strong chance it was made using this exact method or a close descendant of it, whether you live in the UK, the US, or dozens of other countries. Here's what the Chorleywood process actually does. Instead of letting dough ferment slowly over hours, the process that sourdough relies on, the process humans had used for thousands of years, it uses intense high-speed mechanical mixing, combined with additional yeast, fat, and chemical additives called dough conditioners, to force the dough to develop its structure in a matter of minutes instead of hours. The bulk fermentation time that traditional bread needs to build flavor and break down gluten, compressed down to almost nothing. The result is a bread that can be made from lower protein, cheaper wheat, mixed and baked in a fraction of the time, with a longer shelf life and a softer, springier texture that never seems to go properly stale the way old-fashioned bread does. From a purely industrial standpoint, it's a genuine engineering triumph. It let bakeries produce enormous volumes of consistent, cheap bread at a speed and scale that would have been unimaginable to a Roman baker or a French revolutionary. But here's the pivot point, the thing that got quietly lost in that speed. Remember what we said earlier about sourdough's long fermentation partially breaking down gluten and certain difficult-to-digest compounds in wheat before you even eat it? The Chorleywood process and industrial fast bread production more broadly skips almost all of that. There's no 12 or 24-hour window for enzymes and bacteria to slowly work through the dough. There's barely any window at all. The bread rises to its final shape mechanically, chemically, and almost instantly, and a lot of researchers studying rising rates of self-reported wheat sensitivity in recent decades have pointed directly at this shift in production method as a possible contributing factor, alongside changes in wheat varieties themselves. This is not a settled scientific consensus, and there are multiple competing theories about why sensitivity to wheat products appears to have increased in recent decades, including simple increased awareness and diagnosis. But it is a genuinely striking coincidence that the explosion of gluten-free as a mainstream dietary category and rising reports of digestive discomfort tied to bread tracks almost exactly alongside the decades when slow-fermented bread all but disappeared from most grocery store shelves, replaced by bread engineered to rise in minutes instead of a full day. Somewhere along the way, without a single headline announcing it, the bread most people eat every single day stopped resembling, biologically, the bread humans had eaten for the previous 5,000 years. And it's not just the speed. It's what got added to compensate for it. Modern industrial white bread commonly includes a list of additives that would look completely alien to any baker from even 100 years ago. Dough conditioners to strengthen structure without long fermentation, preservatives like calcium propionate to fight mold and extend shelf life for weeks instead of days, added sugars, sometimes surprisingly high amounts, partly to feed the fast-acting commercial yeast and partly to make the bread taste better despite the shortcuts taken elsewhere. And in some countries, bleaching or bromating agents used to artificially whiten and improve flour that would otherwise need weeks of natural aging to reach the same texture. Potassium bromate, one of those flour improvers, has actually been banned in the European Union, the UK, Canada, and several other countries over cancer concerns. But as of now, it remains legal for use in the United States, though many major American bakeries have voluntarily phased it out under public pressure. Read that again. The exact same loaf of bread can be legal in one country and effectively banned in another, depending entirely on which government decided the risk was acceptable. That's not a footnote. That's the hidden layer this whole story has been building toward. The bread aisle in your grocery store isn't just full of different flavors and shapes. It's a map of which countries decided certain shortcuts were worth the risk and which didn't, and most people grabbing a loaf off the shelf have absolutely no idea they're standing in the middle of that decision. Let's pull back out and look at the rest of the world's bread traditions with this new lens, because once you see the pattern, fast versus slow, industrial versus fermented, you start noticing it everywhere. In India and across South Asia, breads like naan, roti, and paratha are still, in most traditional households and restaurants, made fresh by hand, cooked within minutes of being shaped, no shelf life to speak of because they're not built for shelf life. Naan, cooked at extreme heat inside a tandoor, develops char and blister in under 90 seconds. Roti, an unleavened flatbread made fresh daily in millions of households, puffs up dramatically on a hot pan through pure steam pressure, with zero yeast involved at all. In Ethiopia and Eritrea, Injera takes the fermentation obsession to an extreme almost nobody outside the region fully appreciates. It's made from teff flour mixed with water and left to ferment for up to several days, developing a sour, slightly spongy character and a surface covered in thousands of tiny characteristic holes, formed by bubbles of fermentation gas escaping as it cooks on a large flat griddle called a mitad. Injera isn't just bread in traditional Ethiopian dining, it's also the plate, the utensil, and the food all at once, torn off in pieces and used to scoop up stews. In Mexico, corn tortillas descend from a process called nixtamalization, developed by indigenous Mesoamerican cultures thousands of years ago, where dried corn is soaked and cooked in an alkaline solution, usually lime water, before being ground into dough. This process isn't just about texture. It chemically unlocks niacin and other nutrients in the corn that would otherwise remain nutritionally inaccessible to the human body. Populations in later centuries that adopted corn as a staple crop without adopting nixtamalization, European colonizers, for instance, sometimes suffered devastating outbreaks of a niacin deficiency disease called pellagra, because they were eating the corn without the ancient chemical trick required to actually access its nutrition. Bread and bread-adjacent staples like tortillas have quite literally been the difference between nutritional health and disease for entire populations, depending on whether the correct traditional processing methods survived the journey. In Japan, you'll find something stranger still. Shokupan, a remarkably soft, almost cloud-like white sandwich bread made using a technique called tongjeong, or water roux, pre-cooking a small portion of flour and water into a thick paste before mixing it into the rest of the dough. That pre-gelatinized starch traps extra moisture, producing a bread so soft and long-lasting that Japanese milk bread has become an internet-famous obsession in bakeries across the world, chased by home bakers trying to replicate its impossibly pillowy texture. In Jewish culinary tradition, challah, a rich, eggy, braided bread traditionally eaten on the Sabbath and holidays, carries centuries of ritual meaning baked directly into its shape. The braiding itself is often interpreted symbolically, and some traditional recipes involve setting aside a small piece of dough as an offering, a practice with roots tracing back thousands of years. This isn't decoration. This bread, functioning as an act of religious devotion, the same way it functioned as currency in Egypt and as crowd control in Rome. And then there's the bagel, dense, chewy, with that unmistakable shine, achieved through a step almost no other bread uses. Boiling the shaped dough briefly in water, sometimes sweetened with malt syrup or honey, before baking it. That boiling step gelatinizes the exterior starch fast, creating the bagel's signature glossy, chewy crust, a texture you simply cannot achieve by baking alone. Bagels trace back to Jewish communities in Poland as early as the 17th century, and the specific technique of boiling before baking eventually crossed the Atlantic with immigrants, transforming into the New York bagel that's become its own fiercely defended culinary institution, complete with genuine, ongoing arguments over whether New York City tap water is somehow chemically responsible for the authentic texture. Look at how differently every one of these cultures solved the exact same basic problem: turn ground grain into something worth eating, and how none of them arrived at the same answer. Bread isn't one invention. It's hundreds of independent, parallel solutions to feeding humans, shaped entirely by what each culture had access to, believed in, or was desperate enough to try. Which brings us to the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's not about the past anymore. It's about right now, and about a choice most people make every single day without any of this context. Here's the darkest, strangest layer of the entire bread story, the one usually left out of the neat historical narrative. Bread has also, repeatedly throughout history, been deliberately weaponized, not metaphorically but literally, as an instrument of control, deprivation, and in some documented cases, mass psychological experimentation. During the Siege of Leningrad in World War II, bread became the single most desperate commodity on Earth for nearly 2.5 million trapped civilians. At the height of the siege, daily bread rations for ordinary residents fell to as little as 125 grams per person, roughly the size of a small dinner roll, meant to be someone's entire daily food supply. And that bread wasn't even pure flour. Facing catastrophic shortages, Leningrad bakeries were forced to stretch their supply using substitutes historians have documented in horrifying detail, including cellulose, sawdust, and other non-food fillers, just to keep something resembling bread coming out of the ovens. Hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation during the siege, and that scrap of adulterated bread, barely bread at all by any traditional definition, was, for many, the difference between one more day of survival and death. Compare that to right now, to this exact moment where in wealthier parts of the world, an estimated 1/3 or more of all bread produced is thrown away uneaten. Tossed because it went stale a day too soon, because a shopper bought more than they needed, because fresh bread with an artificially extended shelf life still somehow gets treated as disposable. The same substance that people in Leningrad were dying over is treated, by huge portions of the modern world, as an afterthought you scrape into the trash. That gap between bread as the literal boundary of survival and bread as an ignorable, disposable convenience item might be one of the starkest measurements of privilege hiding in plain sight in your own kitchen. And there's one more layer to this, a modern one, that connects directly back to your phone, your wallet, and choices you're making without realizing what's actually behind them. The global bread and baking industry today is worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and a huge portion of that industry runs on precisely the industrial shortcuts we walked through earlier: the fast fermentation, the additives, the extended shelf life engineered to survive weeks in a warehouse and on a truck before it ever reaches a shelf. Meanwhile, a parallel, much smaller but rapidly growing artisanal and clean-label bread movement has exploded in popularity over the last decade, driven heavily by exactly the kind of information you're hearing right now. Slow fermentation, minimal ingredients, a return to something closer to what bread looked like before Chorleywood. But, and here's the reframe that should genuinely bother you, that return to tradition comes at a price most people can't or won't pay. Artisan sourdough loaves at specialty bakeries often cost anywhere from 3 to 5 times what a mass-produced loaf costs at a grocery store. The slow, careful, nutritionally gentler version of bread, the version humans ate for thousands of years by default, has, in the modern economy, been repackaged as a luxury good. We're right back to medieval Europe. Rich people eating the better bread. Poor people stuck with the industrially cheapened version. The exact same inversion of status and nutrition that existed centuries ago under a different, gentler-sounding name, wearing a canvas apron and charging $9 a loaf. The pattern never actually left. It just got a rebrand. So here's where all of this lands, back on you, back in your kitchen, The next time you're standing in a grocery store aisle staring at dozens of nearly identical plastic bags of bread. Every loaf on that shelf is carrying an entire civilization's worth of decisions inside it. Decisions about time, about what fermentation is worth waiting for, about which countries decided certain chemical shortcuts were an acceptable risk and which didn't, about whether a food should be built to last 2 weeks in a bag or 2 days on a counter. None of that history announces itself on the packaging. It's just sitting there silently in every slice. The bread you grab without thinking, soft, pre-sliced, barely aged a day inside its bag, is the descendant of a 100-year-old industrial shortcut designed to solve a scarcity problem the world doesn't even have anymore in most wealthy nations. And the bread that costs 5 times more, sitting in a paper bag at the artisan bakery down the street, is often closer, biologically and historically, to the very first loaf humans ever pulled out of a fire by accident 6,000 years ago, and decided, against every instinct that told them the moldy, sour, forgotten paste should be thrown away, to eat. Anyway, next time you tear into a piece of bread, you're not just eating breakfast. You're holding a fossil of every decision that got made along the way, every empire that used it to buy loyalty, every government that legislated its exact legal shape, every factory that figured out how to make it faster and cheaper at a cost nobody put on the label. It's the oldest processed food on Earth, and somehow it's still telling you exactly who has power and who doesn't, one slice at a time.